Thank you all for being here for tonight's discussion, Visual Journalism and Telling Diverse Stories, the third and final panel discussion in our series of events connected to the Gage Gallery's current virtual exhibition, Black Summer, Race, Resistance, and Resilience. My name is Mike Ensdorf, and I teach photography in the Journalism and Media Studies program here at Roosevelt University. And I'm also the founder and director of the Gage Gallery at Roosevelt. I'm delighted and honored to introduce once again tonight's moderator and Black Summer's guest curator, Vanessa Charlot. Vanessa is a Haitian American documentary photographer, filmmaker, lecturer, and emerging curator working in Miami, Florida, and St. Louis, Missouri. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in English Literature and Sociology from Florida Atlantic University. In her work, Vanessa explores the immutability of the collective human experience by aesthetically disrupting compositional hierarchy through the use of primarily Black and white images. She focuses on the intersectionality of spirituality, socioeconomic issues, and sexual and gender expression within marginalized communities. The purpose of her work is to produce visual representations of varied human existences that are free of an oppressive gaze. Vanessa's photographs have been published in the New York Times, Oprah Magazine, Vogue, The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, The Atlantic, New York Magazine, The Guardian, ArtNet News, BuzzFeed, Apple, and other publications. And now I'll turn it over to Vanessa and this evening's panelists for their introductions and our panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Mike. Good evening, everyone. I'm very, very excited to be engaging with two very brilliant Black photographers that were so gracious to share their work with myself and everyone that has seen their work through this exhibit. The purpose of the exhibit is to do a myriad of things. One of them is to provide an intimate look into Black communities during the height of the protests in 2020. The second thing I sought to do with this exhibit is to humanize Black life in America while discussing visually the pains, hardships, and real effects of racism. Third, I wanted to create the space for Black photographers to share complex and nuanced stories that they cover every day that often don't make it into mainstream America, but are pertinent stories that make up the fabric of this country. I also wanted to challenge the power and impact of Black bodies in photographs. And lastly, I wanted to disrupt the photographic landscape because I believe that the struggle towards freedom and equity and justice is a theme that goes beyond race. But specifically in this country, it is one that Black Americans face every day. So the first photographer I'm going to bring up is Doug Barrett, and he is going to speak a little bit about himself.
Thanks, Vanessa. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Doug Barrett, I am in Manhattan, Kansas, center of the United States, documentary photographer. I photograph full-time. I went to school on the East Coast and did my undergrad at St. Aug University, and I did grad school out here in Kansas at Southwestern University. A camera has been in my hand through all of my careers throughout my life, and it's kind of been a tool that I've used to help share stories, help tell narratives, and I'm just honored to be a part of this panel with you and with Henry.
I'm so excited to have you, Doug. Let's bring Henry in, and he's going to talk about himself.
Hey, everybody. Hey, Vanessa. Hey, Doug.
Hey.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Henry Danner. I'm a visual storyteller from Brooklyn. Well, excuse me, I'm from the Bronx, currently living in Brooklyn. I don't want my Bronx friends to hear that. They're going to get at me. But currently residing in Brooklyn and specializing in photojournalism, documentary photography, and even exploring a little bit of video journalism currently. And, you know, my history with photos dates way back before my history with a camera, because I think I've always been interested in the visual language, pretty much my whole life. Studied family photo albums. I was a big fan of magazines in high schools, and I would always run to like look at the photos before ever reading anything. And I think photography has become a new way for me to sort of express myself, to tell complex narratives, sort of like what Vanessa mentioned in the intro, of communities that I think are often overlooked, or perhaps when the stories are told about these communities, they're told by the wrong people, and they're not told with respect to the power and resilience that exists in these communities. So that, my goals are really to be in service to marginalized and oppressed communities.
I love that. I love that. So Henry, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate both of you guys and the work that you produce. And so the topic is basically telling diverse stories in visual journalism, right? And we're definitely going to jump into what happened last year. But what exactly, Doug, propelled you to want to begin to explore this notion of telling diverse stories in a setting that oftentimes those stories are marginalized? Like what encouraged you to do that?
I think the same thing that we've all said and done is that, the opportunities to share our stories from our perspective, through our lens as Black journalists, as Black photographers, is the narrative that we can understand better than our colleagues or our allies. And who better to give the pain, the sorrow, the happiness, the joy, and understand that better than we can. And I was mentioning this to somebody the other day. Not that they cannot tell those stories, or not that they cannot make those great photographs, but the difference when you have that connection to your subject matter, or the story that you're depicting.
Yeah, yeah. I actually agree with that. I think that in our case, kind of take away the voyeuristic lens, right? Because it's not an outside shooter. Like, we're in the communities, we live there. We often know the subjects that we're shooting, and if we don't know them, we have, and not to say that the Black experience is completely universal everywhere, right? But we have a very personal understanding of their lived experiences, because we're able to find a lot of parallels in their lives and our lives. And so I think that we approach it with a level of sensitivity that I'm not going to say that other photographers don't, but we're uniquely aware of what images say about communities, right? And so, like, we want to ensure that we're creating counter narratives. Doug, let me ask you, Henry, let me ask you, as a Black photographer, what do you think our role is or was in documenting the summer of 2020?
Our role was to serve, I think, as primary sources of information. In the academic world, we're always taught the value and importance of primary sources, and I think that's really what we are, especially when you're in close proximity to the issues that are being addressed in these communities. So I just viewed our role as being able to give a more authentic, story based off of our own lived experiences and experiences of our friends and our family and those in our community. So, again, it's just sort of reiterating some of what you both just said, that, we have, we just have that knowledge, that intimate knowledge. And I think that factors into our decisions of where we point our cameras at, what photos we decide to publish, what captions we write in our photos. All of those things come from who we are as individuals. And, so I think our role was supremely important, because if we were not out there, the story would be left to people that don't have that intimate knowledge. And that's where you see a lot of mistakes made, especially chasing deadlines and, trying to be the first to share things without any proper context. So, just us, being a part of the communities and having that firsthand experience really makes a difference.
Yeah, yeah. Like I often like to think of our work as that we're bearing witness to something in our community. And so, like, paint the picture for me, Henry. Like, what was it like? What is it? May 2020, you were in Brooklyn, right? And then, Doug, I would love for you to paint that picture because both you and I live in middle America and Henry lives on the East Coast. So I'm very curious as to what that was like for you. Like, what did it look like? What did it feel like?
Yeah, it was something I, never expected. And I think I, realistically, because we're in the pandemic, if either of you have been to New York or the people out there listening, if you've been to New York, New York is a nonstop city. It's always on the move, always busy. And the pandemic really changed that. So when the protests, really jumped off and you started seeing people outside, it was like, this feels a little bit like New York again, but it also feels different because there still wasn't a lot of foot traffic, a lot of cars. So we really was taking over the streets, owning the streets. And it
Wow.
just felt like the timing, I don't know, man. I'm still trying to like wrap my head around like why all of this happened the way that it did. But that timing really gave, I think, people, the motivation to get out there, even though they know that they could be risking their health. But it was just things happen every day, left and right, different protests, different you know, rallies, and there was a Instagram account, Justice for George NYC, that popped up and was really keeping everyone up to date and posting on when and where things were happening. So it really, social media also helped in terms of just spreading awareness and knowledge on where things were happening and keeping it, up to date. So literally every day I wake up, first thing I check, Justice for George, see what's going on, figure out what things I could attend and make and move accordingly from there. So it was a really unique and interesting time.
Wow. What about you, Doug? Like, what was it like for you in Manhattan, Kansas?
I think similar. Early on with the pandemic, we had two essential or two critical things going on. You had the George Floyd killing, and then you also had the pandemic, COVID. So during that time, early on, my buddies and I, we thought that we were all going to be on martial lockdown, and that the only people that were going to be out in the streets were going to be photojournalists documenting, the food insecurities, what the pandemic looked like, what the grocery stores that were empty looked like. So in that, we also had the other shootings and the other killings of other individuals across the nation. So during that time, there were a lot of questions being asked of me because my background's a little bit different, is that I come from law enforcement. So being a Black police officer in Atlanta, I was getting a lot of questions asked of me, was this justified? Was this not justified? Did food do okay? So in that entirety of 2020, early on, you then started to have out here in the Midwest, peaceful protests. I didn't have any, unruly protests. Everything was peaceful. We're in a small, quaint town of roughly 50,000 people. We have a college town, and then we have our military base that kind of makes up the Flint Hills. So in that, a lot of the organized protests that were happening were all peaceful. So the narrative that we all saw on TV, things burning, the rioting, the looting, and the narratives that mainstream media put out, I felt the need to show the reality of what the Midwest was experiencing where I am. So I think for me, that was my main goal, was to show what the good of actual peaceful protesting looked like, what letting your voice be heard in a deliberate way as a photographer, sharing that with others was about.
I think both you and I are veterans, right?
Mhm.
So, like, just with that, and you sharing with us that you're prior law enforcement, um, how did that impact the manner in which you approach the situation when photographing?
Uh, uh, Uniquely, because again, you're in a situation where, one, you have a pandemic going on, where your distance needs to, you have to watch your distance. You need to be situationally aware for your surroundings. Obviously, I would always go out with my buddy, and we would always make sure we had line of sight to each other to ensure our safety first. but at the same time, we wanted to make sure that you didn't go home with a virus or get yourself sick. But again, every protest that happened out here was organized in a peaceful way, and everyone that I went to, I at least knew somebody. It was not just a random pop up that just happened. And again, the first one that I went to was right outside of our military base, 2-3 miles from outside of the front of Fort Riley, so right in Junction City. So for us, it made me feel a sense of somewhat peace because I felt the area that I was in was a good area, unlike what we've seen elsewhere where things were a little bit more unruly. But you can't control what you can't control.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Henry, what kind of impact did photographing the summer in 2020 have on you personally? We know that there was a height of seeking out Black photographers and things like that, but I think that the work that we engaged in was, I like to call it soul work, right? Like, it was very personal. It was extremely emotional. So what kind of impact did it leave on you? Like, when you look back on your images, what does it feel like?
Oh man, it was an emotional roller coaster then, and even still now when I look back at the images and think about it, and I say roller coaster because there was days when I was out there and I'm like, man, it's so great to see everyone coming together, feeling very hopeful and optimistic. And then there were days where you would just see the police really using so much force on protesters and journalists, and just feel like nothing is getting through to them. I would see police officers laughing at the protesters, and it's like, why is this a joke? So it's like so many different emotions that I was experiencing in one day, and then over the span of time. But I would say the most profound effect it had on me was just really like giving me an inside look at how movements work and how they function and how all these different pieces of a puzzle come together to gain power and create change. And I just became really fascinated with understanding like what role everyone plays, because I think we get into these conversations where it's like this person's not doing enough or this person is not coming out their house and protesting. But I just really started to understand like the protesters play a role, the people in government play a role, the people at home doing advocacy online play a role, and all of these things kind of culminate and come together. So I never really looked at protest movements and civil rights movements in that way before, but I think just being so heavily, involved in it, that really taught me a lot.
Yeah. What about you, Doug? Like, what did it feel like, or what does it feel like?
It was heavy. It was mentally and physically draining. Again, because for me, I'll speak to myself. It was trying to document what was happening, what was going on. And again, unlike in New York or some of the other cities, I kind of constantly tell myself to stay in my lane because you have the wire guys out there and gals that are photographing and getting in spaces that we necessarily wouldn't get in. It's just regular journalists, documentary photographers. So I had to constantly tell myself to stay in my lane, stay focused on the narrative here and not what's going on elsewhere. I would rely on you guys out there to cover those narratives, because in your mind, I constantly felt like, oh, I need to be there. I need to be here. But again, it's no, tell your narrative right here in your own backyard. And that narrative was the same. Because again, we as Blacks experience the same things that go on that end up making others hashtags. So it was heavy because we experienced that. We understand what it feels like. But again, you have to be mentally tough upstairs to go out and do your job and make your photographs. And again, you come back and there's photographs that I know I still haven't gone through because again, you're trying to get stuff out. So again, it was a constant roller coaster. And then you're still trying to cover the pandemic and everything else that's going on, because 2020 was it was unfamiliar to all of us. We didn't know what was next. So
yeah, no, it was a roller coaster for sure. I find myself thinking about how do you tell the stories of slain Black people without it falling on deaf ears, right? Because of George Floyd happened, Breonna Taylor happened, Dante Wright happened, Andrew Brown right now is happening, Micaiah, I think her name is Bryant, happened. And so like you have this perpetual Black death that's happening. And then as Black photographers, how do you stay encouraged in telling these stories when it's just continuous death and pain of the community, of our community? Henry.
I stay encouraged just by talking to my friends and my loved ones about what I'm doing, because I feel like getting a response from them to know that they're like, they see the purpose and they see the power in it is what keeps me going. Because like I said about the emotional roller coaster, you can get caught up in this news cycle and just be so hopeless, right? But then also, like, to what I said about understanding the roles that people play in the movements, it's like, if you understand what your role is and what your purpose is, it kind of, if you're, I guess the short answer is, if you're just purpose driven, for me, that is how I combat it, because I just accept what my purpose is, and no matter what the outcomes are, I feel like I still have to do my purpose, and I still have to fulfill what I think my purpose is. So it is a tough thing. It's not as simple as I'm making it sound. Probably is, you gotta do your meditation, you gotta do your affirmations, and have those talks with your higher power, whoever that may be, and just kind of really just stay spiritually aligned with what you're doing.
I agree. I think that just in my experience, when a lot of people in media were reaching out to me, it was a bit overwhelming, right? Because like, how do you you're producing this work and you're looking at this work, and the protesters look like family members and friends, right? And then you see the pain of it, and then you have to try to emotionally distance yourself, but you can't. And then exactly what Doug said is draining. And I remember just being curious about, like, how are people taking care of themselves, especially for people that are directly impacted by it. What about you, Doug? Like, how do you find like inspiration to continue to cover very difficult stories within the Black community?
I think everything Henry said, I'll just piggyback off that. For me, I got a praying mama, so she's always praying for me, and I live through that. And then I see myself as the vessel, and the vessel being that I'm here to do a job, and as tired as I get, that narrative that we share still has to get out, because again, mainstream media wants us to hear and see what they want us to hear and see, but I'm actually giving you the raw, genuine stories from right here in your own backyard. And last week, my friends at the soup kitchen gave a narrative of a little boy who was on the beach, and he had a bunch of starfish, and he was trying to get, I guess, all million of the starfish back in the ocean. And somebody asked him, how are you going to get all of them back in? You're never going to get them all back in. And as he picked one up and threw it back in, he said, I made a difference in that one. Picked up another one. I made a difference in that one. So at the end of the day, I know that the work that I'm doing may not hit everybody, but maybe through one of these stories or one of these photographs, it creates a conversation. It creates dialogue through a friend, an ally, somebody to help marinate on their heart, to hopefully create the conversation and make the change that we want to have happen from our work. So
I like that. I think that for a lot of us, we hope that our photographs connect with someone, right? Irrespective of race or positionality. Like, we hope that that person that's looking at the photograph is able to see themselves in the subject and begin to ask themselves very, very difficult questions as to why is it like this? Why does it have to be this way? Covering the protests of the summer of 2020, is there any specific incident that stands out to you that will be forever etched in your mind? Doug.
Anything else to my mind? Nothing. Obviously, I'm grateful for the opportunities to get published through some of the publications that I was published through last year. It feels good. It's a reward for the hard work that you do. But to me, the greatest reward is the conversations that have started to happen, the inclusiveness from things that are starting to change in the circles around my community, and the impact that I have from the direct messages, the emails, recent police officers retiring that have said that the work that you shared has been impactful to me. I'm still trying to get back to people because it's endless, from the DMs to the instant messages. It hits home. So it took time to process all of that because, again, we didn't have time to process last year because it was boom, 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 boom. So now we're still going through work. We're still trying to get caught back up on our lives and now let everything hit us, all the while we still got things going on. So those are some of the biggest things for me. No real major story other than just some of the local things that I was already covering. So, yeah.
What about you?
There was a few, but I think if I had to pick one, I would say the commitment march in DC, which was 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, which actually I got to meet Vanessa in person for the first time when I was out there. To me stands out because for a few reasons, but one story that I'll share is while I was at the march, I had just started journalism school at that point. So I had a class assignment to like write a breaking news article, and I chose to write it about the event since I was going to be there. So this was my first time sort of like in my journalism bag, like going out there reporting, interviewing people on the spot. And I met this lady, her name was Jacqueline Galloway, and I stopped her because she had on a shirt that said, I was there in 1963. I was there in whatever year, like when they did all of the different commemoration marches of the original March on Washington. And I spoke to her, interviewed her to put her in the article, took her photograph. But like when I really sat back and thought about like that this woman was not like an old elderly woman out there walking with a cane, or she was probably like in her late 50s, early 60s. This gave me like that view of like, wow, this stuff is not really that far behind us. The fact that she still feels obligated to keep coming back and keep doing the work, those are the type of things, even to answer some of the last question, that motivate me when I think about all of those that came before that marched, and they was marching in hard bottoms and like kitten heels, like so how can I go home and be like, I got on some Air Max 270s and my feet hurt and I'm complaining, right? So like those type of things, exactly, those type of like encounters just remind me to keep going, because we really have to, carry this work forward, because that's the only way things will change, is if we kind of like draw on the work that they did, and like we also provide hope to them. Like I didn't get a chance to ask her this, but maybe she felt from talking to somebody in the younger generation, seeing them there, that gives her hope that knowing if we have to be back in this place again in 15 years, that she knows that this issue is not going to go away. People are not going to just let it die. So that was one moment that I would say like was super, super powerful in hindsight.
Wow. I remember the March on Washington, seeing the elders there that were also there when King delivered his prolific speech. And so before we go into talking about your photographs, there's a question that I wanted to ask you guys, which is, what is the theme that you think you were trying to pursue while photographing? Were there key things that you wanted to like almost like have a thread, right? Like, so for example, with just to give it into context, like when I produce my images, I always think about like what universal human emotions can you see in this photograph that everybody can relate to, right? So if you see someone in rage, it's not just an angry Black woman. There can be angry white men. There can be angry Asian people. There can be, so like I wanted to dispel the idea that the stereotypes that exist are really true, right? So were there certain things that you were thinking about um, while you were photographing, and were there certain things that you may not have been aware of, but looking back at your photographs, you noticed that you seem to gravitate towards something in particular? Doug?
For me, I tried to focus on the youth. Um,
Hmm.
and it was almost like an energy, like a peace and a chaos, peace and chaos. So for me, I had to get out there and I had to feel it. I had to understand where the energy was at. I had to understand what the feelings were. There was no script, unless I was on assignment for somebody and I knew that I had to make an image. For the most part, when I was out there on my own free will, I had to feel something. If everybody was going left, I wanted to go right, because what was on the right that was going to be missed. So I didn't really necessarily have a theme, but I felt like there was a piece again in the Midwest that wasn't being seen on the coast, and I wanted to continue to show that. And we had kids, we had infants, toddlers, out there, and you'll see that in some of the images where we had out here in the Midwest. But I don't necessarily think that I went out with necessarily a theme, but once I started photographing, I started to see something. Then I focused on that something throughout most of my images, so that I could use my words to put together a story, and share that.
Yeah, I hear that. I hear that. What about you, Henry?
Similar to what Doug said, I didn't, when I first started going out and covering the protests, I didn't really have a theme in mind, but I just had in mind that I didn't want to take photos of what I was seeing in the media. I didn't want to take the photos of destruction and of looting and rioting, because I knew that that was only part of the story.
Right.
But as I photographed and reviewed photographs more, I began to like try to hone in more. And like for me, just resilience and community, I would say, are the two things that I hope like a lot of my photos show. And they don't show them in like a straightforward way all the time, but I try to focus more on just looking at the individuals that were out there protesting as resilient beings, and the support that they were providing each other in times of grief, in times of happiness, in times of anger, while they were out protesting. Trying to just make photos that had elements of all of those in it.
Yeah, I mean, I see that in both of y'all's work, where you guys does such a brilliant job. One, with like in the middle of a crowd, you're able to single out people and photograph them, which I think is really profound. And then when you guys take environmental photographs, it really encapsulates everything that's going on in the space that you're in. So we're going to talk about Doug's work. And Doug, what I would like you to do is for each photograph, talk about it, provide some context for the audience, and kind of explain the significance of the photograph.
This was last year in October. This was the spirit of the Million Man March, because last October, I believe, was the 25th anniversary of the Million Man March from 1995. So again, during the protests that were going on, this event was put together by some local Topekans and some nonprofits and some other Black businesses, where young boys came from across the state to hold up hashtags. I remember one of the fathers was having to explain to his son what a hashtag was. And he jokingly said, we hope that we don't ever become a hashtag. So these 100+ men at downtown Topeka Capitol held up signs, they prayed, they sang music. There was some poetry that was read. And this individual right here in the center of the frame that has the Dominique White hashtag was actually a Black young Topekan who was killed. And it struck me because, again, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of civil unrest, Black men are coming together. And again, you're not going to see this because, the narrative was, they were out looting and rioting, yet and still out here in the Midwest, peaceful protests right on the Capitol. Law enforcement was actually very favorable this weekend for this event. And it just struck me because, again, it was not what everything else was depicting in our community. So for me, it went back to that same peace and chaos.
Yeah. I chose this photograph for the exhibit because I found it to be incredibly powerful when you're looking at the unity among Black men. At the same time, I found them carrying the hashtags to be quite haunting because you never know when another Black man will become a hashtag. The other thing, too, is um, the diminishing of life to a hashtag, right? So it like just the disposal of life, specifically Black life within the American context, is quite scary to me. But I thought this was such a powerful image. And the other thing that I thought was interesting was seeing like the different generations.
Yes.
So you see older men, you see younger men, and I think that speaks to the weight of the situation. Let's look at the next Let's look at the next photograph.
This was right here in Manhattan, Kansas. This is our city, our younger bar district, restaurant district, and this was amazing because this was a drone shot, but this was 2,000 plus people marching down Bluemont Avenue. Just to the right of the frame is where the Triangle Park is, where everybody had gathered. Local Black leaders, local pastors, community leaders all got together with the local chief of director of police, and it was a beautiful event. Again, I didn't have in Kansas, or I didn't have in Manhattan, Kansas, the frames of young generation in front of law enforcement, projecting their voices and some of the other images that our colleagues have. But in this image, it was powerful because this was 2,000 plus people that almost, I think this road is a little over a couple miles, and it stretched the length of the whole road. They went all the way down and then they came back. So again, I have another frame from another protest in Tulsa, Oklahoma, very similar to this. So again, 2,000 plus people and not one person was arrested, no confrontations with law enforcement. So for me, it goes back to the peace and chaos. Again, I stuck with that theme of out here in the Midwest, we're trying to do things the right way, and show that through my frames.
Yeah, I love this image. I love this image. Let's look at the next one. So I have to caveat by saying this is my favorite image. It's such a, oh my God, it's such a heavy image, but it's so beautiful. And like looking at her hat, how beautifully dressed she is. She reminds me of someone on the motherboard at Black churches or something like that.
You must know.
Yeah. But
her name
please
is
talk to this image.
Yeah, her name is G.A. Breedlove. She actually goes to Ebenezer Baptist Church, MLK's church, and at the time, when brain dead, who is our news? Oh my goodness, brain fart. Give me a second here. G.A. Breedlove. This was Congressman Lewis's laying in state in the Capitol in Georgia. Again, back to what I mentioned earlier, where I feel like, when you're on assignment, I was not on assignment this day, I was on assignment the next day. And when all of the photographers went to the other side, because obviously we're in a circular cylinder rotunda, I decided to make the frame where I did not see her face, where the American flag was upright. And she took off her hat, she tipped her hat to Congressman Lewis's casket, and then she touched it just after she had kissed it. So again, for me, I felt like, you know, everybody was going one way. I wanted to go the other way, to see what I saw differently. And I made the frame. And again, to me, this was one of my favorite frames from last year, but it was symbolic to me because, you know, you had one civil rights leader whose life was ending. And then you have George Floyd, whose life ended as well, but his legacy will hopefully change laws, rules, and change a lot for our future going forward, just as Congressman Lewis did. So knowing that now, I know how important this image is to me. So
Yeah, it's you know, I actually like the fact that you can't see her face, because it makes me think of countless of Black women who have had to say goodbye to America's sons. And so, and if you did not say Congress, the late great Congress Lewis, like Congressman Lewis, it could have been any person, right? And because it was taken when it was taken, I think it carries so much weight, because it can be applied to so many different situations. But I think this is such an iconic and majestic picture.
thank you.
You're welcome. Let's look at the next one.
And I mean, we all saw this. We saw this across the United States last year. This individual was out in front of the at a protest, and during the time that President Obama was speaking, he had held his fist the entire time. So I was way in the back, and I had to run all the way around, because I said, "Does that guy have his fist up?" I wasn't sure if it was a handmade something, or, but again, it's 58 years ago, you know, at a track meet, you know, track athletes held their fist up for human rights. And 58 years later in 2020 at this time, you know, the same symbol is being used to represent unity, represent a whole nother level of dimension. And it just to me, it hit me, because this was the only hand that was raised. It was not like it was a protest where all hands were raised. This was the only fist, and he had it raised because, again, former President Obama was speaking, and you can actually see it if you zoomed in, but you can see the cold chills on his arm because he was so moved by the words he was hearing. So it meant a lot that when I made the frame, that I was like, man, that's, to me, that hit me. So
Yeah. And that has definitely become like the universal moniker of struggle and justice and just human affirmation, for sure.
yeah, sure.
Let's look at the last image.
Okay. And as you mentioned earlier, you know, how do you feel? Are you going out there to with a theme in mind? And I did not have a theme, and this was the earlier stages of that 2,000 plus people protest gathering here in Manhattan. And I don't know why this kid, I targeted on his eyes, and then I remember photographing a tighter shot of his face, and then I took a step back in the moment, and then I read his sign, and then just, you know, just, it's one of those that you're not thinking about it, you're just doing it, you know,
Right.
you step back, and then you're like, wow, you know. And it's again, it's one of those frames that, again, this was about George Floyd protest, but then you read the sign and you're like, man, I can't even keep up with the hashtags anymore. It's too many, you know. You used to remember, you know, the three or four that you may have remembered, and now it's hashtag after hashtag, and after a while, reality is you start getting desensitized to it, and it's hard. So this was just one of those frames where I was walking through the crowd and making frames, and I hit on his eyes, and then I took that step back and made the second frame. So,
You know what? You touched on something so difficult to speak out loud, but I'm so happy you said that. The becoming desensitized to the hashtags, to the names, and it makes me wonder, specifically for people of color, do we allow ourselves to become desensitized in order to not fall into a pit of despair, you know? Um, because if we continue to keep up, it is mentally damaging for sure. Um, this image to me really, stood out to me because, like this is a young guy. Um, I was photographing in St. Louis, and St. Louis exists in the backdrop of the Ferguson uprising. And so in St. Louis, the tensions are high. The police are definitely violent. Um, and then it also brought me back to when I photographed Miss Leslie McSpadden for the New Yorker. And I think oftentimes when people have their life snuffed out, um, people don't think about the domino effect. Like it's not just them, it's their mother, it's their friends, it's their family, it's children, it's community, and how that pain ripples out. Um, but again, like it was one of those haunting pictures for me, especially at the bottom, say their name, because you know that more hashtags will be added, and more hashtags have been added, and more hashtags, unfortunately, will probably continue to be added. So it's very difficult to process. But I'm so happy that like you were able to verbalize that out loud. Um, let's look at Henry's photographs.
Great work, Doug. I'm
Yeah, man.
such a fan.
Thanks, Henry. I appreciate it.
Yeah, amazing work. So Henry, can you speak to this image?
Yeah, this was at the march in Washington D.C. in August, and there was a point in the march where like everybody was jumping into the fountain
Mhm.
on the mall, and so photographers were in the fountain making photos of various different individuals, and I spotted this young lady who was in there by herself. And just like what Doug said, about the gentleman that had his fist raised for like an extended period of time, it was the same thing with her. She was just standing there stoic. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead with her fist up, and it just represented so much power and strength as a black woman. Her hairstyle, everything about her just represented like us. And I have a few different photos of her, but this one to me stood out the most from the back because of you can kind of really zone in on her hairstyle, the texture, her skin, um, and you kind of see things from her perspective too. So you get a chance to look at this event almost through the same eyes as her. So all of those reasons to me made it, all of those things combined to me to make it like a strong frame and a strong composition.
I agree. I love how unapologetically black she is in this image. I think it's beautiful. I think the braids are dope. But also the fact that she's facing the Lincoln Memorial.
Yep.
Um, and just thinking about like the historical meaning behind that, the idea of the Emancipation Proclamation. But here we are still having to have um, these conversations around justice and race and equality. And I may be biased, but I strongly believe that Black women are oftentimes the pillars of their communities, right? Zora Neale Hurston referred to the Black woman as the mule of the earth. So like she carries the weight oftentimes. And so I was completely moved by this image. I loved it. I loved it. And I agree with you in terms of the texture of her hair. Like there's no mistaking who and what she is. And I think that is amazing.
Thank
Let's
you.
look at,
Thank you.
no, you're welcome. You're welcome. Let's look at the next image.
This is Gwen Carr, the mother of Eric Garner, and I
Wow.
photographed her at the Brooklyn Museum. There was a event. It was called it was a candlelight vigil for Black women whose lives have been lost. Um, and she was there. She was when I captured this photo of her. She was just sitting there quietly, and it was almost like it was so many photographers around that I was surprised nobody was trying to get her photo. And I was like, do people know who she is? Because it was a younger crowd mostly.
Yeah.
So I just asked her politely, "Hey, can I please have a photo of you?" And she gave me this this gaze that for me is heartbreaking and heartwarming all at the same time. Just to see into her eyes and into the depths of her experiences, losing her son the way that she did, and now here we are all these years later with George Floyd, and it's just a repeat. I mean, she's wearing a mask that says "I can't breathe," which has become synonymous with her son's death, with George Floyd's death, and the fact that it's on a mask. Like all of these layers of complexity,
Yeah.
really to me like made it a powerful image. And I just really looked at it like I got a moment with her, and I just felt her energy in that brief moment, and that's why I decided to put this the photo into the show, because I think we can't forget about all of the mothers of this movement. That's the title of the photo, mothers of the movement, that have lost sons and daughters, and they're still out here. It's propelled them into like a whole new phase of their life where they're just still out here fighting to keep the legacy and honor alive for their lost children.
Wow. Wow. Um, wow, that was heavy. Let's and you know what? Like her eyes are so piercing, but like in a very motherly way. um, Absolutely beautiful image. Absolutely beautiful.
Appreciate it.
Let's look at the next image.
Okay, so this image, so something Doug said earlier resonated with me because he said he was focusing on the youth. And it was a point where I started to look through a lot of my photos and began to realize just how many young people, children, teenagers, young adults that were out there. And I started like trying to hone in on some of that as well. And this protest in specific was very important to me because I convinced my friend Alicia to bring my godson Joshua to the protest, because I was letting her know, like, this was a protest that was led by a church in Bed-Stuy called Epiphany, and I was like, this is going to be a safe protest. It's not like what you're seeing on the news. Please bring him, because he was beginning to ask questions about like what's going on.
Right.
So seeing this young woman, this young girl, out there with this sign was like super, 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 super powerful, because everything about it is true. Obviously, what she has written on the sign, but this was a common sight, just seeing young people out there with their parents at some of these protests. And it's sad, but it's one of those things that also gave me a lot of hope, because I was not exposed to this stuff at their age. So it just makes me think that they're going to be on it, they're already on it. So the same thing I said earlier with meeting the woman in DC, like just feeling like the next generation is going to pick up the torch and keep going. They're already doing it.
I agree. Like when I have conversations with, because I have a 19-year-old or 20-year-old sister, and we're several years apart, so I'm not going to drop my age, but just thinking about how, like she's not worried about niceties, she's not worried about all those things, like right is right, wrong is wrong, period. And I really, really like that about their generation. Like they are very, like they call out discrimination, no problem. They call out homophobia or transphobia or whatever it is. And I really, really appreciate that. So I definitely agree with you. The other thing too that I liked about this image, interestingly enough, is I actually like the sign where you got hearts and stars and butterflies and things like that. And so like it reminds you of the fact that she's still a baby girl. And like her innocence should be protected. Her innocence is beautiful. And the fact that she has to go out there to do that is insane. But at the same time, her raising her voice is such an important thing to do.
Yeah, it's empowering.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
Sure. Let's look at the next image.
Yeah, so this was on July 4th. It was a rally in Washington Square Park in New York City. It was an anti-July 4th protest and rally. And it is what you see. They were burning they were throwing a U.S. history textbook into a burning dumpster. And this image, I love it so much because I was able to catch it before the book went in, and you
Right.
can actually see what's on the book, like what the textbook is. And
Hmm.
because there's no people's faces in it, it just zones you in on like the symbolism of this action. And I went to high school in New York City, and I probably read some pages from this textbook or whatever version of it came before. Like you said, I'm not gonna date myself and tell y'all like there was probably a few versions before that one. And I one of the things that propelled me to want to document the movement is just thinking like when the history books are written and rewritten, what stories are they going to tell? And just the people that did this and led this event were young. They were probably like early 20s. So again, just the youth culture, um, not giving into the respectability politics and just
Right.
they tired of the lies.
Yeah.
And so this moment kind of represented all of that, and just that energy. That energy that day was just outrageous. It was like probably the one day that I could say outside of the DC protest where I'm like, no, I can feel it still when I look at the photos.
No, yeah, I love it. I love what it means symbolically in terms of dismantling the stories that we've been told. And I just thought that it was so interesting that it was you taking the photograph, right? Because we know that like photos and different things like that, like history is often told from the position of the victor and not the victim. And so to be able to have Black photographers that are providing a counter narrative to include in the like American story, like it was just like the photo was symbolic to me, and the fact that you took it was even more so. So yeah, I
Can I
agree
can
with
I share something else
you.
to that point? That was very disturbing thing that I saw take place moments before this moment happened. There was actually they were holding up the book and kind of like talking about it and saying, we don't believe in this history, blah blah blah. But the person that was holding it had the book turned backwards, so it was like you couldn't see the cover of it. And there was a white photographer. I don't want to give him the credit and say he was a professional photojournalist, but he could have been, that literally reached his hand out and turned the book around and told him to hold it so he could see the cover and take a photo. And I just remember looking at him like, yo, what are you doing? Number one, that's not photojournalism in the first place,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
You can't stage your shots. And like, who are you? Like, this is what they're protesting. You're trying to
Yeah.
tell your version of this story, and they trying to say that doesn't matter. Like, this is our version, and this is how we want to do it. So like I'm glad you mentioned that because that story still sticks out like a sore thumb in my mind. Just like I couldn't believe the audacity of that man to do that.
Yeah. No, you know what? Like I have many stories comparable to that, and I completely understand like being taken aback by the audacity. I even remember shooting in the streets of North St. Louis, and like someone telling me, like I need you to move so I can get my shot, and I was like, what is this? Now, not to sound messed up, but like now is not your time, right? Like it's not your time, it's not your space, it's not your community. You're not grieving right now. You came from wherever you came from to take pictures of emotional Black people, hoping that, like you're gonna have a picture that pops. And
Yep.
like photography is so much more deeper than that, right? Like our images essentially is we want to disrupt the photographic landscape and provide like authentic stories
Right.
um, with a Black lens. So wow, thank you for sharing that.
No, of course, of course.
Let's look at the next image.
This image was also on July 4th, so it was a little bit earlier in the day before that last one. And this is a group called Freedom March New York City. It's a group of young Black women, really, really, really powerful, strong young Black women that lead that organization. And I this photo to me was great because of you can see sort of the environment, but also just the emotion and the woman on the bullhorn and leading, and it just was, that day I felt very comfortable as I do every day, to be honest. But I was just so happy that it was young Black women leading that march. Like, so the image really stood out for all of those reasons. But because even if you look into this organization, you'll see they have done a lot of work. They spoke at the March on Washington in August as well. And yeah, just one of those affirming moments again for me, just seeing the future is in the hands of those who are fully capable and reliable and ready to get their hands dirty and do the work.
Definitely. Definitely. Was this the last image? Let's see. Is there another image coming up?
That's a strong one right there.
No, I don't think so. So we're actually coming to the end of the talk. We actually went over. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with you guys. It was so amazing just hearing about your approach and your process and what you think about and how you feel about your images and the work that you're doing. Is there anything that you're working on next? Henry?
Oh yeah. So two things I want to share. One, I'm a part of and a co-founder of a visual artist collective named Souls in Focus. You can find us on Instagram at Souls in Focus. We have a photo walk. We do routinely photo walks and meetups just to bring together visual creatives and network and bond and build with each other on May 2nd in Long Island City, New York. For anybody that's listening that's in New York City or in the New York City area, please pull up on us. The details are in Souls in Focus's bio. And then also it's not really a full announcement. I would just tease that there may be an upcoming show with another group that I'm a part of called the Art Justice Cohort. So if you follow at Art Justice Cohort on Instagram, you can see more details about that, support the artists that are in the cohort as well. And then other than that, just living life, trying to stay focused. That's it.
I hear you. I hear you. Thank you for sharing that. What about you, Doug?
Yeah, so I am just recently funded to get a book done of one of my passion projects, Yuma Street. So I'm going to start working on that, gathering images, and hopefully I will get that out towards the end of the year, which would kind of roll right into my first solo show at the Beach Museum of Art here in Manhattan, Kansas. And then the last two things is pitching a year-long photo story of a young girl that just overcame Wilms tumor cancer. And then trying to continue working on my 501c3 for a homeless veteran project that I started in 2018. So got a lot of irons in the fire and trying to slowly push everything in a forward momentum. So yeah, those are the four main things I've got working on.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Dope.
Well, once again, gentlemen, thank you so much for engaging in conversation with me and sharing your work. It was an absolute pleasure sharing space with you both.
Likewise.
Likewise.
I don't want to carry on about how much of a fan I am, but I am. So I'm sure we'll be in touch. And Mike, can you please close us out?
Great. Yes. Thank you so much, Vanessa, Doug, and Henry, for this really powerful and moving discussion. And congratulations on all of your successes. And I look forward to following you on Instagram. And thank you for the heads up on the organizations as well. And Vanessa, a big thank you to you for allowing us to bring your vision for the Black Summer exhibition and these three amazing panel discussions to the Gage Gallery and to Roosevelt University. It's been an absolute honor working with you, and I look forward to working with you on future projects. Please visit roosevelt.edu /Black Summer to view the exhibition. That's roosevelt.edu/Black Summer. And there are accompanying resources on the exhibition page as well, including the recordings of our first two panel discussions, which were also amazing. And to see more additional powerful work, I would encourage you to follow Vanessa, Doug, Henry, and all the Black Summer photographers on Instagram. I get to see amazing work every day. And lastly, please follow the Gage Gallery at Roosevelt University on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter for updates regarding our fall 2021 reopening. we have really good things planned. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.